Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Admiral Tigerclaw of Samurai Penguin Studios, and today is how to build a Tiltrotor in Kerbal Space Programs. And this is the beginning of our file. So there are a couple of critical things that are important about a Tiltrotor. One is that it flies like a helicopter, and two, it flies like an airplane. So what we're going to begin doing today is we're going to start building the main body right now. And as you can see, I've already got the Mark I business cockpit set up. The only things I really should do right now, just before I forget, is disable the reaction wheels, because those are unrealistic and have no place in an airplane. So goodbye reaction wheels. Next, you'll notice it doesn't have a nose, but that will be fixed in just a few seconds. You know, when things don't freeze up on me, assuming that went through. So I use a lot of procedural parts, such as procedural cones, etc. In this particular case, we're going to work with this procedural cone with charcoal. We're going to get that diameter down, set it to round type 2, give it an extra little bit of length there. It looks like a nose. We've got a good start. So in designing the main body of this, it's just like pretty much any other airplane. It's going to be straight up just a series of essentially cylinder cargo bays. We're going to go with a Junior Mark I Junior cargo bay in here somewhere. Here it is. We're using this particular baby because it has double doors. I like double doors. They look cool. What else do we have in here? Liquid fuel fuselage, structural fuselage Junior. Those are neat, but those are 0.05 tons apiece. What I actually want to use today is an M-hull 3.75 meter. And if it sounds like I know exactly what I'm looking for really fast here, it's because I took a screenshot of a completed version of this I did already and just marked out some of the components for speed of use. Because we don't want to sit here with me fishing through hundreds of mods worth of components, and that is not a joke. That is literally hundreds of mods, something like 112, 120 mods at this point for me. And as you can see here, we're going to be using the M-hull 3.75, and we're shrinking it down because I am actually using tweak scale along with a couple of other of my hundreds of mods. And then we're going to be using a Mark III cargo ramp. Mark III cargo. And that pretty much narrows it down to this guy right here, which is also huge, but we unhuge him here in a second. 1.25 meter. And before we even get anywhere, I should mention that if you've ever played the game SSX3, what this guy will start looking like is the Snow Fox 1 quote-unquote Osprey that was used in the game. The one you see that ferries you up to the tops of the peaks and flies you down, that kind of thing. Now, in order of operations we're going to be working on here today, we're going to be going hull, which I've pretty much completed already, wings, tail, engine assemblies, everything else. So as you can see right now, we've just completed our main hull. Like I said, it's not incredibly complicated to do this. It's pretty straightforward. Cockpit, nose, added on. We're using a cockpit without a built-on nose simply because I want to be able to play around with the nose if I want and change its shape, size, texture, whatever. But that's pretty much what we're going to stick with right now. For wings, you could probably use any of the KSB's cookie cutter wing sets, but I'm going to be using procedural wings, specifically the B9 procedural wings, because they're restructurable and have all kinds of goodies. And for some reason, every single time I do this, that changes into radial symmetry modes, and I am annoyed by those. Must be a key combination I'm pressing when I'm typing in search terms. So, right now, they're kind of an ugly thing. They're just flat squares, but that's where this subset of menus comes in. So right now we want a length of 1, width of 1.875 at the root, width of 1.375 at the tip, if I can make this work properly. So we have a slight offset negative 1.25. Negative 1.25 offset, if, as you can see, gives it this kind of slightly swept forward look. Assuming I can get complete control of my mouse while doing this. Come on, 1.25. There we go. Then thickness of 0.320 and 0.240. And what we're doing here is we are building the wing root. And this is really not important as far as making this work, but it is nice for making it work in Kerbal, as looks nice, blends it in. Now we need to toggle. We're switching over to toggle move, tool move, so we can drag this up, and we're disabling the snap so it doesn't immediately click around and snap to specific points. And we're going to blur this all together. Now we have our wing root, which, if I do this exactly right, is going to blend it in. There we go. To the top of the hull. It also needs to be moved back because I remember specifically with this design, the wings ended up all the way back here. Alright, so now we have a wing root. We need to build a wing next. Now I don't have any prefabbed instructions on my left here for that, so we're just going to start winging it from here, pun not intended. I do remember that I was at approximately 5 meters long. The width was actually going to be something like half. Width at tip was 1.375. So more or less like this, and width at tip was going to be similar. Let's get rid of the surface. Surface trailing edge. No, we don't want surface. We want edge trailing, because that's going to go away because we're going to put flaps and control surfaces on the back of this wing set. Now, because I'm an obsessive compulsive geek, a lot of alignment is going to be very fickle, fine-tuned alignment operations very quickly here. But as you can see, we've already got the beginnings of a wing root structure. Next, obviously, we're going to be taking the thickness of the wings down slightly at the tips. We don't need the wings to be super thick all the way out to the edge. They can taper. And then what we're going to do here is we're going to go ahead and get started on adding in the flap component. I'll explain the purpose of the flap component come the flying portion of this operation. For now, it's pretty much just a trust me and follow along kind of guide. We want these flaps. I want them at, let's make that 3. 3 meters for the interior flaps. They're going to actually be spoilers, but they're flaps for now. As you can see, the reason I ended up making the entire wing width slightly off kilter with the wing root is because that blends in perfectly when all said and done. And then again, we're going to do non-flap ailerons. Of course, these probably look awkward right at the moment, but that's simply because we haven't actually cleaned this all up. There will be a lot of tweaking at the end of this when everything's put together. I've just previously made the same exact video, although a little slower, and apparently my mic was not set up properly, so 2 hours and 45 minutes of doing this, 2 hours and 45 minutes of talking myself blue in the face, and the mic didn't record a single thing I said. Joy. So I am very fresh on what I had to do to get this done. And I'm going to operate this in a slightly more efficient routine. I had one problem that took me 20 minutes to solve in the previous video involving the rotation system itself. And that was simply because the program didn't, or the controls didn't want to play nice until I figured it out again. So right now we are a width of 5 with a width of 3, so we need a width of 2. Hooray, math. If you don't like math and you like aircraft, get over yourself. Aircraft are math. Just like rockets are math. And math is math. But we don't speak of that. So we'll probably have some minor alignment kerfluffles. Yeah, that was actually buried slightly, which allows us to move this one out. And then we can take the edge trailing and we can actually cut the width, and we can take the width here at the tip. We can start making this thing look like it's a bird of some kind. Narrow that in. I'll set that root slightly. And it's starting to look like an aircraft wing. Again, I'm slightly obsessive-compulsive with this kind of thing, and you can just barely see how out of alignment that is. That's better. So we've got the beginnings of our wing system. And of course the engine pods are going to go on the end. And we need to do the next wing set. And that is going to be another set of procedural wings stuck to the back of this. Again, starts out looking crazy ugly. Tweaking thy name is everything. So we apparently have that one. I guess we have to do this the fun way. No snappy. May look like I'm taking slow sometimes, but that's mainly because the mouse and the drag and slide parameters of some of the stuff don't play as nice as they should. Now, in terms of what I'm going to go here, I'm going to go 2.5 is half the width, which is what I want to do, but I want to add a meter to it because it's actually half a meter out. So I want 3.5. Now that may seem huge, but we're about to cut everything down to size significantly. We start by cutting down our width to something like half a meter. We cut our thickness in half, so that we have a thinner tail plane. Actually, we're going to cut that in half again, more or less, because we want a thin tail plane. And then the edge trailing goes away because we're adding control surfaces there too. Positioning on this, the reason I've actually got this a little bit longer is because I'm doing the same overlap trip where they're pretty much just touching right back there, and then dragging the whole assembly straight back. Starting to look like an airplane, isn't it? I actually might cut half a meter off the width of this. In fact, I think I will. So this will be at a straight length of 3. Okay, so we have a main wing with a wing root, and we have a tail plane without a control surface. What's going to happen next is we also need that control surface. So back up here in our menu for procedural control surfaces, we're grabbing more of these guys. And as is to be expected, for some reason attaching them back here, they're not quite aligned. We'll fix that right this second. Now that we have them aligned, we can also do the whole, how big are you? You are 3 meters each, so you can be 3 meters, so that they touch. Not 3.04, not 2.9, 3. 3 shall be the number of the counting, and the number of the counting shall be 3. 4 shalt thou not count, neither count thou 2, excepting that thou then proceed to 3. Monty Python is right out. At this point, we just go 0.12, 0.12. Actually, we'll thicken the root up just slightly so that they match. And then we're slightly low, and of course if we're slightly low, that means we need to align upwards a little. Music playing is my own work. Find it on bandcamp.com under Admiral Tiger Claw or Samurai Penguin Studios, one of the two. And it may get a little repetitive because I've only got, looks like 7 tracks queued, and we're on the middle track. So now we have a tail playing. Still feel like this isn't quite aligned. It isn't. I can see a slight peak, and I am obsessive compulsive. There. Like 1 pixel off. When you stare at these things with anti-alias turned off long enough, you start recognizing the sawtooth shape of a non-straight line. And it will drive you nuts. Alright, so we have a tail plane, we have a main wing. What are we missing? Oh yes, vertical stabilizers. Vertical stabilizers will of course also have rudders, but we will get to that as soon as we get this thing put into place. So first off, biggest vertical stabilizers in the universe, let's fix that down to about 2 meters tall. And shrink these roots down, do something less insane. How about 1.25 meters? And then because we need rudders, the trailing edge goes away. Next, because we want our rudders coming straight out of this thing, we also have to set some offset. Offset of 2.5 seems to work. It looks like it's still got a sawtooth there. I can see it. So we're going to take that 1 more tick. Sawtooth's a little the other way. Switching over to move mode to offset this. I'm going to drag it down. I'm going to drag it out so that it looks like it's actually attached to the wing. And looking at it, I think I'm going to add 0.5 meter to it vertically. So it is now 2.5 meters tall and has some slight hang down. Now, if I attach a rudder directly to the back of this, first thing you're probably going to go is, but Admiral, won't the rudder strike the tail plane control surface? Yes, that is true, but we are going to fix that in just a moment. What did I just click on? That. I actually want to align this. And thinking about it, I'll probably cut that width a little bit down to 75 so that it aligns like thus. Or at least as close to thus as possible. Next, because we don't need the whole thing to be that thick, we're going to cut thickness down to 120 on the whole thing. Now comes the question, how do we fix the fact that that is going to hit that? Answer, offset. Offset tip. We can make that squeeze in so that we have a room for the whole component to swing back and forth. And of course we got to make sure that this whole thing looks like it belongs instead of floating in space because offsets. Weld these parts together. Obviously, as you may have suspected by now, we now have a case of do this again, but with the V-stabs. And as usual, you'd be right. 2.65 is the length I use, so let's use 2.65. Excuse me. 2.625. As you may notice, I may not always say English very well. I'm actually going to do a minor adjustment here because it seems that the individual ticks on this are slightly different, so we'll do 2.5 and 2.5 if it'll let us get away with it. Apparently it does not like to have those match up exactly the same, so we're just going to get close enough and strap them in. Of course, this is hue edge. We're going to go down to 120, 120. And and at this point we have the basic structure of a tiltrotor aircraft. I'm going to take a little bit of a moment here to go through all these wings and make them not look like they all belong on the space shuttle, because I am not a fan of the absolutely random displacement of the tiles. So what we're going to do here is we're going to go surface top, surface bottom. We're going to take materials all to standard, uniform. This may not look like it's doing anything, but if I switch to the underside where you can actually see it, you can actually see what I'm working on. So let's go ahead and do that, where there's something to look at. Taking all our materials and just converting them into uniform aircraft wing looking bits. And we're actually going to do the same thing to the trailing edge here in a second on all these components. So all our primary wing segments are done. We're going to go surface trailing edge, surface leading edge. We're going to get rid of surface top, surface bottom. We're going to work our way across the trailing edges, and they're actually going to start looking rather nifty as parts that look like they belong together. Uniform, uniform. Now they all look like wing control surface quadrants, segments, whatever word you want to fine tune. And since we're doing this at a pretty high rate of speed, leading edge, gonna do reinforced on that because that actually makes it look kind of cool, and then we're gonna go standard on that, makes it look like it's got leading edge slats, even though it doesn't. Same with this back here. And you guys. So now we have a pretty uniform looking aircraft with just a big black nose. Call it a little Snoopy nose or whatever you want to call it. I'll go ahead and save for the moment. That way we're all set up. Now I can still see just some slight misalignments here and there. I'm not too concerned about those at this point. They look pretty decent. I might mess with this flap a little. Base. Let's see. Width root. If I make width root, it's going to give it kind of a triangular apex. And since we're right here, before we start working on the engine pod assemblies, I'm going to go ahead and start walking through configuring each set of wings for their job. We're going to start with the interior flaps. Standard control surface, I don't actually want these to act as flap surfaces. I want these to act as deep sweep spoilers. And that actually requires me to... Spoilers usually kick up. I want them to kick down, specifically because these are going to be used in 45-degree engine flight as a drag modifier. This is important because when the engines are configured like a helicopter, they have to have a thrust-to-weight ratio significantly greater than 1, or all you do is sit on the ground moving air. So when you convert all that thrust to a forward flight vector, or even a partial forward flight vector, that's all the acceleration in the world. So you can imagine that you need to keep from going to crazy high speeds when only in 45-degree flight. Thus, a super deep spoiler configuration. Now you may notice I'm also doing spoilers on these. Flap spoiler deflection will also be a negative 45. And of course, because the ticks on this thing are like pixel-wide ticks, getting it exactly right is an exercise in cramping my hand. 45.5 will work. Standard control settings, we don't want this to control pitch, we don't want this to control yaw. We do want 100% roll, and we want a roll rating of maybe 10 degrees on these for now. Rather than have anything horrible go wrong with this, we're going to go ahead and save that. Move back here to the tail plane. Oop, wrong button. I don't need to do that anymore. We're going to do standard controls on these guys. These guys are going to control pitch, but not yaw. I'm also going to allow them to have about 25% roll authority as well. and we're going to have them deflect up to 15 degrees. That'll give us plenty of wing control at moderate speed. Likewise, we're going to do some work on the rudder. Rudder is useless for roll, rudder is useless for pitch, it's all yaw. But we're going to go 10 degrees on them. We don't need a super huge amount of rudder. It's mainly just to adjust for side slip and other small issues. So right now we have our body. Now we're going to work on our engines. Engines are important, of course. In order to do this, though, we need to access one of several critical mods for this aircraft. The critical mod in this particular case is going to be Magic Smoke Industries Infernal Robotics. Now, I should warn everyone here, I am running several versions of Kerbal Space Program behind, mainly because I have, like I might have already mentioned, 120 mods in this, and 120 mods is not something you want to go and hunt down each individual mod for over the course of 6 hours. So that's probably how long it took, and then I still forgot a mod here or there, and just had to go hunt it down. Plus, I've also got some customizations, like atmospheric customizations. Like, my atmosphere doesn't end at 70 kilometers. My atmosphere ends at 100, and I've made the atmospheric scaling match. So, what I've just added is I've added Infernal Robotics Rototrons, and I've shrunk them down slightly. These are your actual tilt rotor components that tilt your engine nacelles. Like I said, for this is critical. Without these, you're stuck using the generic modded-in tilt rotor parts, and they don't work right because they use thrust systems that run on engines that spool up and down, so their thrust response is really slow. And slow thrust response will kill you, because you realize you're descending too fast, you add power, and the engines just don't get up to speed. So, now that we're working on the engine nacelle pods, we're going to go back over to procedural for procedural parts, because we want a procedural structural element. Procedural structural element is very important here, as we need to be able to just go and attach it directly to that rototron. And then we have to make sure that, because it doesn't want to align perfectly, we get it aligned. Before I do that, I'm going to go ahead and shrink it down to diameter 625, length, I think it's 1.5. Probably shorter than that, but I'll fix that once I get to it. We still got parts to add. But first I'm going to make sure it is aligned on the rototron, or it's going to be really funky trying to make that rotate. And normally I would say remember to disable snap, but that actually solved the problem there of getting that aligned dead center. The other thing I'm going to do is I'm actually going to overlap it into the rototron so the rototron's kind of mounted inside it. Alright, there are 3 more major parts that have to attach to this. Part 1 is going to be something you need from an old version of firespitter. It's the firespitter FS adjustable rotor, which, when I typed FS, was one of the first 2 that popped up. FS helicopter main rotor tweakable. With the FS helicopter main rotor tweakable, you do have to follow its pattern. In this case, the arrow on top has to point forward or it doesn't like to play nice. Now, it may look awkward at the moment, but it is a tweakable component, so you can actually shrink this down, adjust the scale until it overlaps that nacelle smoothly. I think it's like 77%. Let's see what it does at 80. And then we're going to actually suppress it in slightly so that it looks like the nacelle just blurs right into that cone. Now, a couple of settings I did remember from this is I wanted a blade length of 1.1 and I wanted 3 blades. And an engine size of 1. I'm not sure exactly what that does aside from if you don't have the engine size all the way up, it behaves as if you don't have enough manifold pressure. not enough manifold pressure translates into, as you add collective, the rotors slow down and you lose power until the engine catches up. Which is, honestly, not the best thing to have happen when you're trying to keep this thing running. You want enough power. You really want enough power. So, let's cut that length down some more. We'll go down to 1 meter. That's starting to look more reasonable for the engine, for the rotor assembly. The next thing we want is one of the components I also have named off here is actually a custom component. You'd have to go and modify this. I have a J85 GE4 turbojet. And that is simply an additional... That is an additional engine added by Advanced Jet Engine. It's actually a default engine available with Kerbal, but modified as one of many real-life engines. The important component of this particular engine is that I am using a modification I punched in on its file itself. I made its generator produce a heck of a lot of power because the firespitter rotor does not produce electricity when it's on. This is unfortunate, but I needed to do it, and all I'm really doing is I have it generating a lot of power, so I can just go thrust limiter, value of 1, produce like 100 EC a second, so I have an electric production from my rotors. Easy peasy, lemon squeezy. Now, I'm just being a little bit of a nitpick about visuals. This is what I usually like to use for my rotor design, color, or texture in this case, but there's other options on here. I have them all installed. There should be a silver one in here. Here it is. That looks like a fuel tank of some kind, or a just big metal cylinder. Now, the other thing we also want to try and do is make sure that this thing is going to rotate centerline on the rototron. So I'm making sure the part is centerline, and the whole assembly is kind of centered, just 'cause. That looks good, that looks good. Let's go ahead and save this beast. It's actually starting to look like a tilt rotor vehicle. Now, with tilt rotors, center of mass is God. Center of mass is very God. In a helicopter, center of mass is important. In an airplane, center of mass is kinda important. But in a tilt rotor vehicle, center of mass is absolutely critical. The reason for this being that, as you can see, if these rotors are pulling up, they are actually a lever on that center of mass sphere. They're going to pull up on the front, which means the back of the vehicle is going to try and drop, which means you have to counter with other control forces. The more you got your center of mass right between the rotor blades, the more it's just going to pull it straight up. If the center of mass is too far forward, it goes the other way. We're not going to quite mess with center of mass tweaks just yet. We've got a couple more parts to add that are important to the overall design of the vehicle. One thing I'm going to do right now, though, is add a slight dihedral to the main wing configuration, if the thing will behave. Just enough to lift it up. And then we're going to go and make sure that rotor assemblies aren't tilted inwards like before. Keep them in place. Now, another important thing to keep in mind is the not only do you need to keep the center of mass between, more or less front to back between the power of the rotors, you also have to consider its position up and down when you rotate the rotors forward. If in this particular case, I can tell you right now, before we're done, we're going to see torque that tries to push the nose down when those are all the way forward. I know this because both times I've done this before in this design, it's done that. But right now, we still got to add a couple more moderately heavy parts to the configuration, starting with the landing gear. Now, the important thing about the landing gear is I am using adjustable landing gear. Does that have a mod name? Kerbal Foundries is the one that's doing that in full now. And I'm not sure since I've done this, and since they've upgraded, if they've fixed it up much. But I know for a fact that I want my landing gear to have a max safe load of 4 tons. That's this number down here where I'm pointing with my mouse. Because I know this vehicle, when it's done, is going to be weighing just shy of 5.5 tons with fuel. So I know what mass this needs to be able to handle. Now this is my front gear, and I want my front gear to not have a motor, because this thing has all kinds of fun toys. I have brake force limits, I have steering limits, a couple of things I want to do. No motors, because we have no electric motors in this thing, we don't need them. This particular version, the steering always seems to be messed up, so I actually have to always invert it. Not to mention, it thinks the front of the gear is the back of the gear, because as you may notice, that's like the back end of the landing gear component. But we're going to just kind of work with it for now and drag it over. Strut angles, wheel angles, strut extensions. This is a really nice setup. The other thing we're going to do here is, because the way the friction works with this thing will drag over really hard, really fast from the slightest yaw input if it's rolling down the runway at any considerable speed. So what we're going to do here is we're going to cut these steering limit low, highs, and responses way, way back. And this is experience talking with this particular version of the mod. This would yank your aircraft all over the universe and back again, if you're not careful. Next, I don't need the aircraft sitting this high off the ground, so we're actually going to start burying this thing. It looks kind of funky at first, but once you get used to it, it's actually kind of cool. Boarding. Alright, so for our next trick, we need another type of landing gear. We need a pair of aft gear, and they don't need to be super huge either. I'm going to set their brake limits to 50 since it's right there, lock the motor, turn the motor off, turn off the steering, flip the gear, getting a whole bunch of stuff out of the way, and of course flip the gear around like that. And probably flip the gear again because I think I just goofed up. But that's okay. Next we need to scale this down. I want this to have about 5 tons safe load on the ground. See, we need to bring the wheel dampening up to 0.7. That just keeps it from rocking on its wheelbase. And then what we're going to do here is we're going to line it up and adjust it. And we're just going to try and push this landing gear wheelbase in so that it looks like it blends as much as possible. And you may be saying, Admiral, this is starting to look like an airplane. Or in this case, a Tiltrotor. The reason we're trying to get this thing as low to the ground as possible is because if you're imagining having to crawl in and out of this thing, you really want to jump to 5 feet up. Make this thing as random person friendly as possible. Now, for final tweaks on this aircraft, there's going to be a little bit of work done around the wheelbase here, because the wheelbase is going to be pretty wide, and that's good, because that keeps it stable as well. But it's going to be mainly just adjustments up and down when we get to flight testing this vehicle. Now, so far, we've got body, wings, tailplane, control surfaces. We've got our rotor assemblies, which actually thinking about it, I could probably shrink down even more. And then we can adjust ever so slightly up. Just keep that center line on the pivot point. Pardon me, I'm also drinking water because talking dries your throat out fast. And so far we have more or less a vehicle. What else could this vehicle need? Well, we obviously need battery power, which is going to go in here in just a second. B-A-T. T. This is my entire battery selection. I'm kind of fond of this KW Rocketry BX5, or BXS. Plenty of power. I'm actually going to kind of strap that to the underside of the wing root that's buried inside the plane here. And then bury it into the root just enough so that if you need to get at it, you can still click at it with clever camera movements. Also, you may notice this is flat, this is round. These are so close together that the aerodynamics calculations really don't care. Plus, that flat surface has an actual good use that will come up at the lighting portion. Speaking of which, we're pretty much to lighting. And as you can see, center of mass has pretty much centered on mid-root chord here. But we're going to do some improvements here in just a second. One I just remembered is edge trailing on this particular craft was something I actually like to stretch out a bit. Just kind of makes it blend in with the body better. I may also do the leading edge just to see what it does. So let's stretch the leading edge. Let's make it blur with that ring line on that body. That looks nice. Now, we just have one issue. How well does that look when it opens? Looks a little funky. But we're going to fix that here in a second by raising this assembly up slightly. Merge it with that ring so it looks like it blends. Still looks a little campy, but so far we're coming along pretty quick compared to my previous video where I fought with everything constantly. But next we need surface lighting. And I have a couple of tricks up my sleeve when it comes to lighting. First off, we need, of course, forward nose wheel steering type lighting. Don't mind that. That's not meant to be there for very long. I'm going to do this, going to do this. We're going to grab this guy one more time. And we are going to stick him under the nose. It looks like it belongs on the landing gear now. What we're going to do next is we're going to partially bury this guy as well, and then aim him down slightly. So we're going to drag him back so that looks like the gear just noses into him. Raise him up, rotate him so that he looks forward and down without looking like it's sticking out of the surface of the plane. So to about right there. So when this light comes on, you've actually got a forward glow out and in front. Or I should say down and in front. Likewise on the wing undersides here, we're going to do more or less the same thing. We're going to go essentially right to the wing root right here. We are going to maybe not scale that at all. Rise it up, bring it forward, rise it up, rotate it to look down, and go one step further. Since we're already looking forward, we're going to rotate to look out. So you can see the lights glowing on the ground there. We can adjust it so that we have moderate overlap but a nice wide field of view in front of it. We'll add the center line. We have a nice overlapping wide field of view in front of the vehicle. We're not quite done with the exterior lighting sources yet. We have one more major set of lights, and these will go on the tail here. Shrunk down, of course, to half scale. Now the purpose of this is when you're trying to land these vehicles in dark or in light, you can't really get that last little bit of fine sense of distance on video game textures. They stop improving in detail beyond a certain limit, and you're not quite sure how high you are off an object. Well, what we're going to do here is rotate them to look out and down towards the back of the vehicle. And of course, we're going to bury it into the vehicle slightly and line it with the deck here. Not too close, it bleeds through. We don't want bleed-throughs. So the purpose of this is when you're on approach, you have a set of lights angled out your back that give you an idea, more or less, where your tail is about to come down. Because as you get closer to the ground, this kind of X pattern of lights will slowly converge until they're just under your aircraft. And that gives you a visual cue when you don't have access to a good angle for your shadow, like that shadow there from the light up above and behind, which apparently glows into infinity. Lights off. Lights off. Now, because I'm a nitpicky little punk of a person who likes lots of little details, we are still not done with lighting. We're going to be operating with our FAA-approved standard operational lighting. Beacons, strobes, and nav lights. I actually have the mod for nav lighting, which allows me to essentially just grab things like these beacons, nav lights, red on the left, green on the right. Always got to remember it's opposite of R. Stick it on the back here. Or I should say the side. Oh, and we forgot one more important component of the engine to sell. And of course, an important component of maneuverability. But since we're on lights, we'll go ahead and finish up the lights real quick. Nav light white. Nav light white is really your livery whites. Lights. Blech. English. Use them to light up your aircraft. Or in this case, it would be lighting up your logos. Lighting up your body. General, making the aircraft visible. Advertisements. And then you have strobes. Now if you've ever looked up in the sky at night and seen jet airliners going over, they have those fast blinking double whites. That's these guys. Their purpose is to pretty much go, here I am, here I am, here I am, here I am, all day long. The nav lights red and green are to tell the person looking at you what side they're on. These strobe lights always have a double flash. So now we've got an aircraft that's pretty much ready to be lit up. And now we're going to finish adding that one last component, which is an intake. Now I can't really see what I'm typing very well. I have a record 720p and a frames per second button up there right in front of where I type. It makes things kind of annoying. These guys look a little big, but like everything else, they shrink down nicely. And this is important because this jet engine has no air intake otherwise, and another component I'm about to add also requires air. See, at the moment this aircraft has roll authority, has pitch authority, but in a hover this has no yaw authority. So we have to compensate. And this is mainly because a Tiltrotor's computer system is going to handle some of the off-kilter behaviors of rotor collective and cyclic, as well as the torque of the engines to produce sideways rotational motion. We don't have any of that because these aren't programmed to be anything other than regular single-chord helicopter blades. Also going to go steering response 1.5 because I remember I need that for a little extra steering control. And these will be found under command and control, which is where all your thruster is. This is Tetragon Projects, which is, if I remember correctly, more B9 Aerospace. And these are surprisingly heavy pieces of tiny little thruster components. But I guess it also simulates having all the vents and such run to them. And of course you want to get these maneuvering thrusters as close to your center of mass on the non-active axis as possible. So in this case, they actually do need to be kind of up here, but not like up here on the tip of the vertical stabilizer, otherwise it's going to try and, for example, trying to yaw left, point your nose further to the left, that would actually try to roll you right if it was way up there and above your, because it would be acting like a fulcrum in the vertical plane. How's that look? Would that look better with a different color? Let's take a look. It kind of looks awkward right now. Nothing's quite the same color. People can't make their textures play nice. That's probably why I use that texture, one of the similar ones. Now, of course, because of the way the thrusting works, one of the other dynamics is if I put a left turn on my nose for yaw, it'll thrust out the left side here. But without a counter thrust on the other side, it's also going to try and push the whole thing physically to the right. So I want something a little over here, up front, that will act as a slight counter force to the thrust turns. And because this is not designed to be a cyclic and collective that is shared, I also need some support for roll authority. And that's easy as putting these guys way out here just shy of the rotors. Actually, that's looking good. Let's line that up with the rotor. Rototron. Okay, now it's lined up. So now it'll have roll support, pitch support. It's already got pitch. That's commanded by the actual rotor blades. And we're just going to duck these into the hull a little bit so they don't look like such obvious blisters. So far, so good. Anything else missing? Well, let's add a Commutronsky to this thing. Essentially just a little cute little radio antenna that fits nicely on the back of the airplane here. And that'll just give it whatever radio operations this thing is going to need. Let's not make it snap, let's slide it until it looks like it blends into the center line of this thing. So far we're looking good. We are currently sitting around 4.993 tons. And as long as we're almost at finding our weight balance, we're going to go ahead and add our fuel to our centerline tank. I'm putting the tanks right up here in the wing root kerosene to keep it as close to center balance. It's 318 liters, I guess. 319 liters, 318.5, 319. 319 liters per wing root, so that's actually 640-ish, roughly, total. That'll come up with a weight of 5.5 tons, so right around where I was expecting it to be from the last couple of builds. Now, for all intents and purposes, this aircraft is almost done. Everything is here. I've already preset most of this equipment. Now it's simply a matter of programming stuff in. One of the first things to do is we need to program in the robotic components. And that means finding which direction is forward. That's forward, so we need to invert that guy, invert his axis. We're going to bind the limits. That should be 0 to 90. And that's that. That's the first one over here. That's that is right nacelle. That makes this left nacelle. And then we want to do 90 to 70. Which is not correct. We want 0, 90. That's not 180. This is actually the part I ended up running into. $270.0. And of course this is going to be a pill until I get it figured out. It's always like this, but with the visual now, I can actually see what the heck I'm doing. There we go. Now, those should be bounded for accelerate and decelerate. One of the things we can actually do here is add an extra blade so that it's sticking straight out, and we can make sure that the blade is not in fact going to clip the wing at all. And from what we can tell, that is not going to happen, which is good. I'm going to go return to 3 blades. 5 is to the left, thus slow down. 6 is to the right, thus speed up. And those correspond to my keyboard commands on my console, or especially the number row on my keyboard. Now that we have that, we can start working on making sure all our systems are center aligned and all our buttons are programmed properly. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to get our center mass cleared up. Our center mass is currently the way back there. We don't need it that far back. We need to bring it up forward. We also need to bring I know from experience we need to bring the rotors down. And that's mainly just the rototron, not the actual rotor assembly. And that's just to lower the mass on that towards the ground somewhat. We can cut mass strength multiplier to 5 instead of 1. Mass strength is essentially kind of the universe going, alright, how many reinforcing ribs have you put inside these wings so they don't rip apart? Not exactly super ultra rocket science. And with just enough tweaking, we can actually move the mass of the vehicle towards the front with relative ease. And one trick I've learned, since I don't have a proper... Well, RCS Build Aid doesn't really know how to read these and tell me how much torque I am. I can just kind of use the regular engines and their thrust lines, line them up, know exactly where they are on the screen there. So what I can do here is actually highlight this guy, drag him off to the side, and then he's going to be most of the mass movement here. As long as I keep those two lines lined up, I'm looking straight down that axis. Now we've balanced our center mass as far as forward and back is concerned. Next thing we've got to do is the even harder task of getting as much of that spun out as possible. And actually we are still slightly forward. And we can actually fix that with just a tiny adjustment of the whole wing assembly. And that's only talking about the torque we're getting in vertical format from these engines like this. Where did build aid go? We have less than 0.53 kilonewton meters of torque on that axis, which is an extremely tiny number and more than enough for the whole vehicle's control system to account for. We want it that way. Now the fun part is when we transition to forward flight mode, what kind of crazy shenanigans do we get on this angle? We are looking at 7.6 kilonewton meters. That is actually rather atrocious. We can fix that. I of course have to sacrifice some of that dihedral I wanted. As well as adjust for certain mass properties. In this case, the rototron center point of the connection hub probably needs to drop down again. Another thing we can probably do is shift this whole assembly up. That's not producing enough of a mass difference to matter. So we actually have to get into the willy-nilly of adjusting tiny portions. Mainly this is important because when you're in all forward mode, that massive torque ring says the engines are going to pull this thing forward over the top of the center mass and try and push the nose down as it flies. Need some water in me. .5 is honestly not too bad, although I had it down to 2 point something. As you can see, it starts to look a little awkward when it's drifting so far down off the wing, simply because there are some mass inconsistencies. One thing I could probably do, since we're still on below 6 tons, we've actually dropped a little mass, I can actually add mass rating of up to 4 on that structure, although that quadruples the weight. We don't really want to quad the weight on the wings. We may have to just go with what we've got. Might as well be worth testing here just a second. Now, of course, this is not the actual torque of the wing mechanisms at all when we're talking about this. This is the fake torque of the GE turbojets turned all the way up to max. Let's go ahead and straighten these two guys out since we lowered the dihedral slightly on that. And now for the next part of this operation. We pretty much have the tilt rotor set up how we want it. Gear set. Now we have to actually configure all the controls. One of the first things I'm going to do is I'm going to get rid of the spoiler activation that's attached to the brakes. We don't want those attached to the brakes. We want those in an individual command elsewhere. And both sets of spoilers I have to remember to set. Now, as far as the engines, we're kind of trying to make this thing act as if it's all one big engine control system. So we want toggle engine on both the rotor set and the jet engines so that we have power startup. Next, we have the lighting. The beacons are a single flash, so we want flash toggle on the beacons. Flash toggle on the beacons. And then on position 8, we want all our navigational lighting. Regular nav lights are going to be single light on toggles because they're just going to glow. Our strobes are double flash toggles. Look at me, here I am. Regular nav lights, single light on. And the red and green nav lights have to be individually done on each side, unlike all the other mirrored parts. This vehicle should more or less be about ready for a test flight. We have fuel, we have all these configurations done. The only things I haven't done is set the doors. Go ahead and do that right now. 7 for the ramp. And I like to, since I have 2 different ones, I actually like to do 8 for the toggle door. So 7, 8, 9, 0, control doors and lights. 1 powers up the engines. 3 will control the specialty flaps. I usually reserve 2 for either an APU or reverse thrust. 4 doesn't get used very much unless I have more than that. 5 and 6 are programmed through the robotic components to control these guys for our rotor assembly. So we're going to save. I'm going to take one last look at this thing. We are going to make sure that our thrust limiters are set back to 1 so that they're just power generators and not thrust generators. Save one more time. Try and remember if I forgot something critical in going through all of this. I'll find out here in a second. And hit launch. It's going to settle down. Let's see. And before you ask, no, I will not name all the hundreds of mods I have. Some of them are obvious on the screen. Most players will play with a lot of these. But let's go through some standard routines. Let's make sure that these guys work as advertised. Yep, they dropped to 45 degrees as desired. Massive, massive drag flaps. We go ahead and set them to the mode we're going to need to fly them in. Let's do a rig test. That looks good. Do a throttle test. We can actually see the specialized firespitter rotors twitch up and down as I shift power through them. They're not spinning, of course. They actually spool up and actually have spinning, and how fast they're spinning will actually affect how well they bite the air. We're going to go ahead and set camera to locked. Start our beacon, start our lights, so you can see how close it really gets on that lighting. Start our entire flashy, stroby, glowy, lighty bits. And then adjust our camera. Now the next thing we need to do is, because this is a rotorcraft and we don't have simulated gyroscopic physics from the discs, we do want SAS for stability. Gyroscopic stabilization is actually a thing with rotor-based equipment. Spinning things tend to not like changing directions, which means helicopters actually don't like to continue to start to drift into rolls. At least not too much, unless their thrust is just offset. And now let's start the engines. The sound effect you're hearing is actually custom. We have RCS on. Let's do a left roll, or left yaw, right yaw. Swinging back and forth. We're looking good. It's yanking us about. That is not the reaction wheel. I disabled that right at the beginning of this construction session. Now my goal here is that when I hit 50% throttle is approximately where I want to take off at. Not lower, not higher. The dead zone you can program into the controls actually makes it so that you can get in the middle of a throttle setting there, an area where it's a lot more fine. We got lifting power. We are lifting off. That is good. Very small tweaks on the throttle assembly here. This is very good and very promising as a start to the operation. We are flying like a helicopter right now. I'm doing roll tests left and right, kind of rocking it around. Stick back, stick front, yaw, yaw. Thrusters do their job. Let's add a little bit of forward power to the engines, make sure nothing tweaks or freaks out. We start to pick up speed. Take off the brakes just in case we touch the ground while the gear are down. And with the giant skirt of just drag flaps we've got set up right now, even though we have all this engine power, we're at a thrust-to-weight ratio of approximately 1 right now, with it slightly pulled forward. We should be accelerating like a bat out of hell. In fact, let's bring the gear up. Let's make the engines forward a little more, adjust our flight. As you can see, as we adjusted the engine power setting, it did pull slightly. And now we're flying at approximately 44-45 knots. We're almost to a 45-degree angle on the nacelles. But because of all the drag produced by these absolutely huge skirt flaps, as I like to think of them, or cape flaps, we are just not accelerating at all. But when I raise them, see a great increase in speed. And one of the important things is as you transition all the way to full forward on the tilt rotor, I'm actually going to reduce power. And then keep the power in the first third, because you don't need all the extra power once you're in full forward flight. And then you can disable your SAS and fly the aircraft like a plane. Now, I don't know how the animation is recording things on the display here. But the animation of the blades is actually not converting to any like sweeping texture animations. It's continuously trying to draw the blades in every spinning position in every frame. So it may look like it picks up and slows down weirdly like a camera would record it. We've got a pretty good cruise speed, and simply because these engines aren't calibrated in any useful way, we've got a couple of configuration goof ups. In this case, we have 1 day, 1 hour, and 25 minutes of fuel in these engines. That's a Kerbal day at 6 hours. We are traveling at 260 knots on just 2 little notches of the throttle down there. It actually does not take much, and that's actually pretty decent for cruise mode. They become more and more, the throttle will actually go up slowly as you increase altitude to very high altitudes. Right now I'm just in the process of bringing it around gently because it's traveling at a pretty decent clip. 250 knots at only 250 meters off the ground is pretty fast. FAA regulations is 250 knots below 10,000 feet or slower. And if you're wondering how well does this thing perform in actually doing maneuvers, you roll this body over, pull back on the stick. We've obviously got a time slow down to about 60%. Let's correct out of a roll here. And I've turned SAS off and the thrusters off for forward flight. We're operating on regular control surfaces. A little bit of yaw kicks just to show that it does actually spring itself back into forward flight. And then I'll use one of my other mods, Real Trim, to kind of stabilize my flight so that I can let go of this thing completely. I have let go of my stick completely. As a hint of I've done this, I am right-handed with my mouse and my stick. To grab my mouse and drag the camera, I have to let go of the stick. It is flying this stable. I'm actually honestly surprised that I managed to get this thing completely stable like this on flight 1. So, for the moment, let's practice our next component of this flight. We're going to slow down In this case, I've cut the throttle all the way back to 0 collective, so this thing is just going to kind of blah. We're going to keep that nose off the ground. As we slow down, I'm actually going to start bringing this thing back. Houston, we have a malfunction. This is going to kill us because apparently there is a glitch with the right side engine. It's not paying attention to the... As you can see, that's what happens when the nacelles don't act right. Apparently the limits on that nacelle is messed up. Before we go squish, we got to go find out why that did not program and stay programmed. I knew I was asking too much of it to be perfect on the first flight. Definitely knew I was asking too much of it to be perfect on the first flight. Let's find out why we have decided to glitch out. For all intents and purposes, this should be correct. Let's do another field test, make sure these engines are... Nacelles rolling forward, nacelle is rolling back, that's good. Throttle to 0. Control sets. Camera set. Time mode. Now it looks like it's behaving properly. Sometimes that configuration can just not like it, especially if you're mirroring parts like this. Flying this like a helicopter. And of course I'm using navball HUD, or whatever it might have gotten its name changed to at this point, simply because I like tracking the velocity vector and just seeing a kind of ghostly pitch ladder all over my screen like this. Now we'll kick those engines forward for power. Accelerate up to speed. Pick our gear up. then we'll pick those flaps up. Now they actually do slightly behave like flaps, even though I've kind of set them like spoilers, because you can see it actually adds some lift before it just goes into extreme drag. Tells you a lot about how much this vehicle likes to fly when you can control a flight just meters above the ground. In this case, I think we're about 10 meters above the ground, because I believe most of the plane here is only about 76 meters above sea level, or 60 something. When we get these rotors all the way back, the aircraft just kind of loses speed on its own, loses lift, and we can go ahead and just drop in the skirt and watch that thing kick a bunch of lift, slow us down to something like 30 knots, and we just maneuver like a helicopter. Getting a feel for both how helicopters and aircraft fly and understanding what you need to do as you transition between them, or even blend them, is important. I want to gain some altitude. As you can see, there is some slight behavioral that the conventional tilt-rotor built-on engines just don't like to do, or don't like to counter. One, I've got immediate control of how much vertical thrust I'm getting, thanks to the collective, which means I don't have to wait for engines to spool. And two, because the cyclic is actually built in with some support from my thrusters, I have immediate response to the engines as well, and just rocking my stick around. Everyone look outside, it's a pretty day. Now, one of the behaviors you may see is you've got to remember that the huge tail plane on the back of the tilt rotor acts as a lever to your center mass fulcrum. So a high-speed climb in a helicopter-like configuration translates into a force down on the back of your aircraft. If I do this and add just all the collective in the world, I end up losing control after a certain point. Same is true in reverse. All the way back on the stick, no control. Luckily, thanks to the rapid response of the collective, I can come out of those. Although in real life that would probably stress the airframe something fierce, especially if it's loaded. Now when you're maneuvering like a helicopter, it maneuvers just like a helicopter, except with the large tailplane. Helicopters will generally have some kind of tail structure as well, if only to help feathering and essentially keeping it in certain stable flight regimes, depending on the vehicle. But they behave just the same way if they're out there on the boom. Now what I'm getting ready to show you is just how maneuverable this thing is. We are very nimble. Although we don't turn super fast, we are definitely no regular airplane. I mean, can an airplane come in for a touchdown at less than 10 knots? Rock slightly to the right. You just got to be careful with your side slip. A narrow wheelbase might try to flip over, and if you add power to a narrow wheelbase as you do that, you run the risk of flipping over. And boom, we are touchdown. Right on that H. This was not random guesswork. This was not luck. This was raw skill and control. Let's go land on something a little more difficult than the smaller one there on the administration building. But we're going to do a roundabout approach so we can come around from the other side. I know we're running into about an hour 30 minutes at this point in this video, but if you've gotten this far, to see just how smooth and in control this vehicle really is at this point, I'm sure you're going to want to try and build it. The key point is you really have to find what version of firespitter, it's an older version, has the old firespitter tweakable, adjustable rotors. Once you can find those, you may also have to do some file surgery to get them to work on the fuel you like. I actually forcefully programmed these things to take kerosene. Alright, let's stabilize our flight pattern here. Use our thrust authority to spin us around. There's the admin building. We're just going to gently roll on towards it. It may look like I'm actually tweaking this thing more than it needs, but that's just because I'm kind of looking at the control surfaces to see if the rudder is overlapping with the tailplane control surfaces as I tweak it. Which is actually unnecessary, but it's in such good control I can do things like that and not push it out of control very quickly. This is a smaller, harder to land on helipad. If you know what you're doing, awesome. Come in gently, side slips and flare appropriately, add power because I'm pretty sure my shadow is really close to the top of the thing. Settle her down, lock the brakes, and we're on the surface. On a helipad, it's only slightly wider than the wingspan of the vehicle. This vehicle cruises nicely with autopilot-based mods. Let's disable that, let it stabilize and rock into position here. Shut down lights. Shut down engines. I'm Admiral Tigerclaw, and this has been how to build a basic tilt rotor.